Before we start off with any beta footage or even anything relating to Wind Waker, I need to address the very beginnings that would lead to the famous Zelda GameCube tech demo shown off at Space World 2000. Development of a new Zelda game had started just as Majora's Mask was in its final stages of development in 1999. Design managers Satoru Takizawa and Yoshiki Haruhana had been thinking about how the next game would look like, and decided that it would be best to continue with the art style that Ocarina of Time had established. With Mitsuhiro Takano taking the helm at the director's seat, this would become the basis for the Space World 2000 tech demo that was publicly shown off, as Miyamoto himself has verified in a Nintendo interview. If you were to actually go back and look at when we were doing experiments on the Nintendo GameCube hardware itself, it would be more than 2.5 years ago. The reason we were able to show you the more realistic looking Zelda battle at Space World 2000 was because we had been doing some preliminary experiments with the console prior to completing Majora's Mask. That's why the video existed. By the time the general public was in full hype about the tech demo, the dev team had already started rethinking their thoughts on making the game's aesthetic based on Ocarina of Time. The current team at the time couldn't come up with new ideas and concepts, and development stagnated to the point where it halted altogether. Then, one day, Haruhana randomly drew up this Link sketch, and showed it to Takizawa. This new Link design had sparked a fire of inspiration in Takizawa, that he immediately created a moblin based on the new art style. They also discussed new ideas that came up when looking at this new art style, such as how animations should work, and how they should fight. These two seemingly random drawings would become the basis for Wind Waker's entire aesthetic, such as how the now famous cel-shaded graphics allowed for combat to have more flair when fighting. The team, now consisting of Miyamoto and Eiji Aonuma on board, considered new styles of how to get around the new world. They decided that sailing would be the new form of transportation for Link, and what followed was a storyline where there was an ocean above Hyrule, after it had been sunk by the gods long after the events of Ocarina of Time. With the sailboat now being essential for this new world, the developers thought that the easiest way to give players hints on where they should be going was to make the boat Link sails actually talk to him. The idea then spawned into the boat being the King of Hyrule later down the line, and even King Daphne's No Hands in Hyrule's design would be inspired by this idea. With sailing comes the importance of the element of wind, and it became an integral theme of the game during development. Wind was rendered in a way that development teams of the past could not have done on the Nintendo 64 thanks to the new hardware. The instrument that Link would use on this adventure was also in tune with the theming of wind, as it wasn't originally a conductor's baton at first. Instead, the dev team chose the relatively unknown and quirky 20th century instrument called a theremin, and if you don't know what it is or even how a theremin sounds, here's a short little clip of a theremin player. The GameCube also allowed more expressive animations than any of the Nintendo 64 Zelda games, and the new disc format also allowed for NPCs to do things independently of each other. The one thing that the GameCube could not do fluently, however, was loading. The team experimented with a lot of different island sizes and positions on the ocean, only to find out that the GameCube would not load the islands if they were either too big, placed too close together, or even if Link approached them too quickly. So each island was taken into account its size and position on the Great Sea into the places that you see them today. As for the inhabitants of the Great Sea itself, we know the story behind a couple of them. For instance, the characters of Tetra and Zelda were always planned to be the same character from the very beginning. The reason for this was that Aonuma wanted to confuse experienced Zelda players into wondering where did Zelda go. Quote, "This time around, the princess doesn't appear at the start of the game. I wanted to build up to it, with experienced Zelda players going through the story wondering where the princess had gone only to realize, oh, it was her all along." For Link's sister Aryll, her name comes from a deviation of similarly named characters from the Zelda series. Think about how there's Marin in Link's Awakening, or Malon in Ocarina of Time. Link's sister's name was going to be Meryl as a homage to this trend, but over the course of time, the team had shortened it to Aryll. The design of the Korok and Sage of Wind Makar was decided based upon many different unused ideas to use him in gameplay, that ranged from a floating platform, using him as a hookshot target somehow, to even, as Haruhana states, walk on water. The development team didn't feel good using a character as an actual mechanic in this nature though, so they resorted to the ability to plant trees as seen in the final game. The wind gods Zephos and Cyclos were also created very early in development from another scrapped idea. A companion-like character similar to Navi was considered during the earliest developments of Wind Waker. Designs for this supposed companion ranged from a cat to what was described as an acorn with a face. Ultimately, a companion character was scrapped after the decision was made to have the sailboat talk, but one of the designs drawn up for this idea was a frog on a cloud. Later, when the team was debating on how Zephos and Cyclos would look like, Anuma remembered seeing the frog on a cloud design and suggested using that design as the basis of Zephos and Cyclos. Mechanics such as enemies picking up objects were also implemented after a discussion about how cool it would look if Link could use enemy weapons. In fact, this idea about enemies picking up weapons added in more animation frames to Moblin enemies, even more so than the bosses of dungeons. As the team continued to develop the game, other ideas or mechanics were implemented or thoroughly changed in hopes of creating a new world, and mechanics not seen in any previous Zelda game. Ropes were implemented to act with more realistic physics, in part due to the efforts of a programmer who worked on the whips on the Majora's Wrath boss fight in Majora's Mask. The team also debated on whether or not to change Link's eyes red when fighting. The controversy within the team didn't allow for this to happen completely, and even when they did some testing, the team found that it didn't look right, so it was immediately scrapped. They would still add color in Link's eyes though, as early test players from Europe requested it, and with some back and forth between developers and some experimentation, they went with the final look of black pupils with a slight green haze. Miyamoto also yearned to experiment with the idea of incorporating a two-player mechanic into the game somehow, via the Game Boy Advance link cable, and have the second player interact with the first player, similar to how fathers interact and play with their sons. The idea of the Tingle Tuner was created, with Miyamoto directing the rest of its development to Toshiaki Suzuki, future director of The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures, and the producer of several modern Mario Party games.